Hello, everybody. I'm so glad you've joined me for a semester-long discussion of ancient Egypt. No, it's just going to be 40 minutes. I used to teach a semester-long class on Egyptology, one of my favorite classes. I've dug in Egypt. I was working there, oh my gosh, 1978, 1981, in the Wadi Tumilat, in the area just a little northeast of Cairo. Wonderful archaeological discoveries and things. I've taken several tour groups to Egypt, and I'm looking forward, just like you, to visiting Egypt again very, very soon. Either on the World Cruise, that would be great, wouldn't it? Or on one of the Viking Nile cruises. Those will be wonderful too. So glad you're here. And if you realize Egypt's constantly in the news with archaeological discoveries being made, they recently analyzed the skull of a pharaoh and discovered he had been murdered on the battlefield by the evil Hyksos, Pharaoh Ptah, the beginning of the New Kingdom. There's a recent discovery of one of the world's oldest breweries, a royal brewery at Abydos, probably belonging to the palace of King Narmer. What a lucky man. I'll talk about him later on. And, oh, did you hear about a mummy recently found near Alexandria with a golden tongue? Yeah. No, the tongue wasn't solid gold. They had wrapped gold foil around the tongue of the mummy, apparently in a belief, this was back during the Hellenistic period, that golden tongue would allow him to talk his way into paradise. What a neat thought, eh? So, James, let's do that first cover slide. The pyramids of Giza. The three big ones, pharaohs. The smaller ones, the important queens of those pharaohs. That's right. And there they are, a wonderful place to visit. Never want to visit there in the heat of the summer. Avoid that plateau of Giza unless you want to go at sunrise or if you want to go near sunset. It's very, very hot in the middle of the summer. Egypt is well known as being an area that has both a mixture of desert and then the green Nile River flowing down through it. Next slide, James. So in today's presentation, I'm going to be talking about some basics, geography and terminology about Egypt. I'll be talking about the Old Kingdom, the Middle Kingdoms, then the New Kingdom, the very famous one for which we associate Ramesses II. Well, he's far more important than King Tut, let me tell you, in terms of being a world shaper and mover. Talk about the Greco-Roman era and the importance that Egypt played in the Roman Empire, and then talk about things happening in Egypt during the 19th, 20th, and 21st centuries. All that, I promise, and try to tell you a few stories I hope you've never heard. Next slide, James. So on the map of Egypt, you see the Nile River, which flows from the south going north and emptying into the Mediterranean, and where the modern capital city of Cairo is located, and the mouth of one of the two mouths of the Suez Canal. As an archaeologist, I was digging an equal distance between Cairo and the Suez Canal. And so there's archaeology in that part of the country. There's archaeology in almost all parts of Egypt. The archaeology in the Delta, though, is extremely interesting because it had changed hands and been conquered at one point in time by people they called the Hyksos, the Cursed Asiatics. If you go on the river cruise that Viking will offer soon on the Nile, you'll be starting in the area of Luxor, and you'll be cruising up to the Aswan Dam area and visiting some of the wonderful sites up around Aswan. Just absolutely gorgeous. The best way to travel Egypt, my friend, is on the deck of a cruise ship, watching the countryside slowly pass by and stopping about every 4 or 5 hours at different archaeological sites. By the way, there are archaeological sites all the way from Aswan to Alexandria, but the most easily accessible, the most famous ones, are the ones in that very area between Luxor and Aswan. Next slide, please, James. Oh, what would a college professor be without dates? Yes, they're not on the examination. Don't worry about it. And in fact, these charts have some wiggle room to them. So ancient Egypt, put at 3150 BC, Is that really when it started? Well, I'll tell you, we've actually get Egyptian hieroglyphic writing as early as 3400 BC. So maybe we should push that little pink line a little further to the left. In fact, it's been a long contention as to whether civilization emerged first in Mesopotamia or it emerged first in ancient Egypt. And in reality, if you push it back to the point where hieroglyphic writing starts and where cuneiform writing starts in Mesopotamia, well, there's probably less than 100 years. And is Mesopotamia really a generation earlier than Egypt? I'm sure archaeologists will still be arguing that and looking at the dates and the radiocarbon analysis long after I'm gone, trying to figure out who started civilization, or did they start simultaneously? I suspect that'd probably be the safest way to describe it. But there have been many archaeologists who tried to explain Egyptian civilization as sparked by things occurring in Mesopotamia, and others who have argued that it went exactly the opposite direction. Certainly, the Egyptian civilization lasted longer than the ancient Mesopotamian civilization did. In fact, well into the Christian period, there were people still writing hieroglyphics in Upper Egypt, in the area up near Aswan. Some of the last hieroglyphic inscriptions were made in the 4th century AD. So you might argue that in some ways its civilization most certainly continued far longer. Next slide. Oh, and periods of time. We oftentimes refer to pre-dynastic Egypt as the period before some of the great architectural monuments begin, before the pyramids of Giza and Saqqara, but at a point where a city called Hierakonpolis, the first city formed in Egypt, would create around 3100 BC. Old Kingdom is the pyramid building phase. Middle Kingdom, a period of great artistic and literary achievements. New Kingdom, oh my gosh, the point where Egypt expanded its power outside of the Nile Valley, deep into Africa and far north up into the area of Asia. The Roman Byzantine period, after the conquest of Egypt, first by Persians, then by the Greeks who throw out the Persians, and then the Romans who displaced the Greeks. And a long, complex story there. The conquest of the country by the armies coming out of Arabia, the Muslim armies, and led by Caliph Omar, the period of Ottoman rule, British occupation, the Sultanate, and then the modern Republic of Egypt. Next slide, James. So this artifact on the right-hand screen there, this is called the Palette of King Narmer. And that's because that's the name of the king that's written on it. We can read the hieroglyphics, they're very clear. And he's showing himself as a victorious battlefield king. He's actually got several different captives held by their hair, and he's getting ready to use a battle mace to basically knock each one of these guys out, probably kill them from the blow. This was found, this artifact, and it's about, 2 to 3 feet tall and about 1 meter in size, is currently on display in the Cairo Museum in Egypt. It was found by British archaeologists, Quibell and Green, who were digging a site called Khum Ahmar. Khum means mound, and Ahmar means red. Now, it was chosen by these two archaeologists to excavate because it was in Upper Egypt near Hierakonpolis, and all the other mounds were kind of gray colored. This mound was red, and they were scratching their head. Well, maybe that's a sign we should go dig there. And as they excavated it, they found that it had been a shrine to the earliest Egyptian rulers and to the god who protected those rulers, the god of Horus. He's the falcon-headed god. And you know, what's interesting is I used to argue for my students, and it's a debatable question, that this stone artifact is probably a replica of a shield that had actually been used by King Narmer. The shield would have been out of wood with cowhide covering on it, but would have been painted and decorated. It was his heraldic shield, if you would. And after centuries, a shield out of wood and cowhide, even in a dry environment like Egypt, will disintegrate. You know, insects and bugs and funguses will cause it to deteriorate. And so what they had done was they had created a stone replica of what had probably been the pride of the king, and that showed him always as victorious, and of defeating cities that refused to capitulate to him. Cities in Egypt, as he led himself to unify Upper and Lower Egypt. Famous Narmer palette, obviously on every Egyptian 101 class discussion and examination. Next slide, James. So, mummification. Oh, I bet a lot of young adults and school students who might sign into this will wonder if I will have a story about mummification. Oh, indeed I do. There is a mummy that's in display now in the British Museum, as well as those calcite canopic jars with their painted lids that are also in the collection of the British Museum. Let me talk a little bit about this whole question of mummification. The ancient Greek historian Herodotus wrote quite a bit about mummification, but he said he had a hard time getting anything that he could really base a lot of facts on, because there was a trade secret. That is, the people doing mummification didn't want to let go the formula or the methods. And there was also religious incantations and things that were part of the essential role of mummification that Herodotus wasn't sure he had gotten the full story on. But basically, we've been able to examine mummies and look at Herodotus' account and believe that he probably got pretty close, that there had to be a removal of various organs from the body that would tend to deteriorate and cause biological breakdown of tissue. The most famous of these is, of course, the removal of the brain through the nose, and then the washing of the body with a cedar water solution that also facilitated sort of as an antiseptic, and then the packing of the body and the covering of it with a substance called natron. It is a mineral that naturally occurs in Egypt in the desert area, and natron sucks out the moisture, and it basically turns any tissue into sort of like jerky. So if you think about beef jerky, beef that's been dehydrated. And if you think of a mummy, it's a human that has been dehydrated. And the Egyptians used the method not of fire and smoke like we make beef jerky, but they used the method of natron to draw out the moisture from the body that would allow it to then be wrapped and that would allow it to be preserved for this concept of an afterlife that would be essential for the body to be in good condition. Now, those canopic jars there in the middle picture with these wonderful heads, these belong to a woman whose name was Nes Khons. And we know that the hieroglyphics explain all that. And she had been buried with her mummy and with some of her preserved internal organs in those canopic jars. And then there had been a wooden prayer placed with her. And it says, this woman was the chief singer and priestess of a temple. She was beloved of her children and her husband. And then this is the best part. It says, please do not let her ghost come and harm us. Yeah, Mama died mad. And apparently either the husband, the children, or the whole family wanted that incantation. So she understood that they had taken proper care and respect for her mummy and the mummification process. Those are some of the most beautiful canopic jars, by the way, I've ever seen in any archaeological excavation. But they also wanted to make sure that the spell was there, so she would not come out of her grave to cause harm to those who feared her pretty clearly. Next slide, James. So the Old and the Middle Kingdoms, they are wonderful times where Egypt built great monuments and great wonders primarily only within the Nile Valley. We know there's a brief period during the Old Kingdom when there is a colony that leaves Egypt and goes up into the area of modern-day Israel, Palestine, and created a small settlement up in that area. And there's considerable debate as to why this colony went that way, and then why, after maybe a generation or more, it retreated back into Egypt. One suggestion is that many Egyptians believed that if you died outside of the land of Egypt, you didn't get to go to heaven. You had to be for almost ever damned. And so it probably became hard to get people who wanted to stay the whole time in their little outpost. Next slide, James. Oh, the wonderful sites from the Old Kingdom. The step pyramid of Zoser, built by his architect Imhotep at Saqqara, the painted tomb walls at Memphis, and paintings at the Meidum Pyramid, and then, of course, the Great Giza Pyramids. Just this month, the Egyptian government announced the discovery of the tomb of a queen at Saqqara, very close to where that step pyramid of King Zoser is located. This queen, whose name is Net, N-E-I-T, which is also the name of a very famous Egyptian goddess. And it's a pretty smart thing to have yourself with the name of a goddess. And she was a queen to one of the pharaohs named Teti. And she had been buried in a tomb that was only found just in the last couple of months. Now, by the way, the Egyptian archaeologists have been excavating in the area of Saqqara, where this new tomb was discovered, for over 10 years. So when you oftentimes think of archaeology, remember it's not quite like Indiana Jones, where he goes out and finds what he wants in the first day. It took years to find King Tut, of careful excavation and clearing of areas. And it took 10 years of excavation to find this new queen, Queen Nit, from the Old Kingdom that has just recently been uncovered. Now you see those pyramids. Why did they invest so much into those pyramids? And why did they go ahead and build temples and other things around them? A question I'll answer in a slide or two. Next slide, James. So besides the massive pyramids and the Great Sphinx, by the way, which is just an awesome thing, there were temples around the pyramid complexes with these phenomenal statues of the pharaohs and their wives. Menkaure is shown here with his wife on the left-hand side, and then with goddesses surrounding him on the right-hand side, his wife on the left side. Sorry about that. Now, here's the answer for why pyramids were so important. The time period of the Old Kingdom was a period where in Egyptian religion, they believed that when a pharaoh died and his wife, they became gods and goddesses. And if you were fortunate enough to be buried near the pyramid of an Old Kingdom king and queen, then it was sort of like being placed right next to a vacuum cleaner that was going to suck you up and take you up to paradise. Now, the concept of an Egyptian afterlife would change. There would evolve. Egyptian religion was never a static thing. But for the period of the Old Kingdom, pyramid building was so important because building that pyramid was probably seen as part of the process of making sure the soul of the pharaoh went into an afterlife and went in with glory. And if he was happy up in the next life, the king would look down upon all the people who had served him in his court and bring them with him. He would look down even on the poor guys who helped build the pyramids and got buried out there around them. Pyramids were not built by slaves, by the way. They were built by Egyptians. And he would bring them up also. And in fact, even if you weren't buried there, going to the pyramids and praying and leaving offerings in the temples of these pharaohs and their wives still might get you a little bit of a chance of what? An escalator ride up to paradise, where you would still be whatever social position you were in this life, and the king would be a god. And for that reason, they invested huge amounts of money and huge amounts of effort in making these magnificent structures, and then making some of this beautiful statuary that went along in the pyramid temples associated with them. Next slide, James. So, the last king of the Old Kingdom was named Pepi, and he's probably one of the longest living pharaohs. We know so much about him. And in his later years, he became so caught up with this idea that he had to have a great pyramid, an escalator into the paradise, that he bankrupted the budget of the kingdom, making his last pyramid and his last funerary structures. And literally, when he dies and people discover the kingdom's bankrupt, we go into what's called the first intermediate period, a time period of social breakup and of lawlessness, until finally there would be established a new kingdom around 1800 BC. And apparently, all future pharaohs were given a little memo when they took office, and that is, you don't need a pyramid to go to the next life. Just a nice tomb with some painted walls will do you. So we don't see any more of these pyramid constructions after the breakup of the Old Kingdom. But Middle Kingdom has beautiful tombs, rock-cut tombs with, again, paintings on the walls and scenes of the afterlife that the pharaoh and that his friends would be accompanying into them. Now, it's really fortunate that some discoveries made a century ago gave us fragments of papyrus documents that let us understand many things about the Middle Kingdom. We don't have as much papyrus documents from the Old Kingdom that survived, but Middle Kingdom documents, we have enough to learn about their mathematics, to learn about their medicine, and to even read a little bit of a docudrama that was left behind. The medical document by the Rhind Papyrus, wonderful papyrus, has a whole series of symptoms that a patient might show, and then advice to the physician as to what types of procedures could be used. And in fact, many times there will be a symptom described, and the physician will be given three options. First of all, to tell the patient, I can cure this if you will follow my orders. A second was the symptoms would be given, and the physician would be advised, tell the patient, I will fight for you and work with you, but I can't guarantee anything. And then the third option for some of the symptoms, it said, there is no treatment that we have for this. Simply pray with them and tell them to be good, because there wasn't going to be a solution or a healing. Kind of interesting, kind of some of the same things physicians tell us now, depending upon the skill of medical science. Now, of the papyrus documents from the Middle Kingdom, my absolute favorite is a docudrama. You know what a docudrama is? It's sort of like The Crown on Netflix right now. It's got some reality, and then it takes some liberty and fictionalizes something. The docudrama papyrus that I love more than any other is called The Doomed Prince. Ready for the story? I'll try to keep it short. A king and queen of Egypt had been childless for a long time. Finally, she bears a son, and they're so thrilled. They call three wise women in. You might call them witches. And they say, predict the future of our son. The first says, I see the future. This boy will die from a cobra. The second one shakes her head. She goes, I see his future. He will die from a dog bite. And the third shakes her head. She goes, I see none of that. I see a crocodile. Oh, the king and queen are just heartbroken. What, three bad predictions for the only heir of the throne? And so they come up with a plan. They will send the little baby to a military base far out in a desert oasis, probably in the Fayum oasis. And there they will tell the soldiers to guard this boy and to let no harm come to him. And so the baby is sent off to a regiment of Egyptian soldiers in the desert, and they start raising the little boy. And what do soldiers do? They teach him how to shoot arrows and throw sticks and, ride horses and ride chariots. And one day the little boy, he's looking out from the walls of the fort, and he sees a shepherd with a sheep and the sheepdog, and a little puppy is following the mother dog. And he turns to the soldiers and he goes, can I have a puppy? They don't know about the prediction. They go down and they buy the puppy and they bring him to the little boy because they think this poor child has no playthings. He has no playboys, mates. He should have a dog. And so the dog grows up. Now, when he reaches age 17, 18, a notice comes from the palace to the soldiers. And it says, kill the prince because his mother has died. The king is remarried and the new queen wants him put to death. And the soldiers, they've been raising this kid for 16, 17, 18 years. They don't have the heart to kill him. They said, look, your mother, your stepmom's going to kill you. Take a chariot, take a spear, take your dog, and hit the road, son. Go up north. And so he then goes up north. He crosses the Nile. And as he crosses the Nile, as his shadow is in the water, he's on a boat, a dark crocodile comes to the surface. And as the young doomed prince rides his chariot off the boat, the crocodile starts to follow him. Well, the doomed prince, he goes outside the area of Egyptian control. He goes all the way up to a kingdom called the Hurrians. He goes to a city called Nagar, which is today in modern-day Syria. It's called Tel Brak. And he gets there, and he's strong, and he's handsome, and he speaks kind of a Semitic language, but not the same one the local boys do. And he goes, hey, what do we do for fun around here? And they go, oh, every evening we go over to the palace of the king of Nagar, and his daughter will hang out of the upper tower and wave at us, and she is so beautiful. So the doomed prince goes to the rest of the guys, and they stand under the base of this tower, and they look up, and this incredibly beautiful woman leans out and waves, and she sees the one guy that doesn't look like anybody else because he's an Egyptian. The rest of these guys are Syrians. And she like throws him a kiss. What does he do? He pulls daggers out of his belt and he wedges them into the cracks of the tower wall, and he climbs up the wall like Spider-Man. And when he gets to the top, he comes into the window, and she is beautiful and he is handsome. And so they lock and kiss, and there's touching and all the things that go along with young love. And suddenly the door opens. And who is it? It's the father of the princess. He sees the Egyptian. He goes, that young man will die. And his daughter looks at him and she says, if you kill him, I will die. And she must throw her arm out the window. Yeah, it's the problem with having a princess in a tower, isn't it? If they want to die, they can die by simply falling. And the father, he understands his daughter. He goes, well, then you will marry him today. And that's it. And she goes, that's a deal. And so they get married. And on the wedding night, she's sitting there, and her new husband, the doomed prince, he goes, you know, there's actually some kind of a prediction I'm going to die from a cobra. She goes, thanks for telling me. And as he sleeps, after fooling around, she puts a bowl of milk by the door of the house. And sure enough, at 4 a.m, a cobra slithers in, and it starts to drink from the milk. She uses the sword of her husband. She cuts the cobra's head off. She wakes him up. She goes, look, I've saved you. You're not doomed to die of a cobra. And they go back to sleep. Yeah, sure. And at sunrise, he gets up and he calls to his dog. He goes, follow me, dog, on a walk. And as they're walking along a lake outside the palace of Nagar, the dog says, surprise, I am your fate. I will kill you. And the dog starts foaming at the mouth. Now, what do you call a barking dog that talks with foam out of his mouth? Rabies. And so the doomed prince luckily jumps into the lake, and the dog with rabies won't go into water because rabid dogs don't like water. And the doomed prince is thinking to himself, I've escaped. But suddenly a dark shadow in the lake comes up. It's a crocodile. It grabs him. It doesn't put its mouth on him. It grabs him by its arms, and the crocodile wrestles him and says, look, you, I'm not going to eat you. because you're the king of Egypt. Your father has died. Get on your chariot, take your beautiful bride, and go south back to Egypt and rule as a wise king. And the crocodile lets him go. And the doomed prince comes on the shore. His friends have killed the rabid dog. He calls to his wife. He goes, we're getting in the chariot and we're leaving. And he goes back south. He gets to Egypt. He gets to Memphis. And he finds indeed both his father and stepmother have died. And he is acclaimed to be the new Pharaoh. The end. Now, I've filled in some gaps. It's a fragmentary papyrus. We have to kind of like interpolate a few things happening here. But quite a docudrama series. I should sell that to Netflix and see if they want to talk it up. But this is some of the literature that we have in papyrus. So not all of it's Book of the Dead. A lot of papyrus documents are Book of the Dead, which are spells to get you into the next life. We have a lot of them from the Middle Kingdom. But we've got mathematical, medical, and even literature. Next slide, James. New Kingdom. There would be a invasion of Egypt at the end of the Middle Kingdom, and a period in which it would be half conquered by people out of Asia, actually out of the Hurrian Empire. And then the New Kingdom would rise up to establish a new glory in not only the Nile Valley, next slide, but all throughout much of the Middle East. It's during the New Kingdom that we've got great pharaohs like Ramesses II and Amenhotep II, creating phenomenal buildings and palaces. The Temple of Luxor, the Temple of Amun, the Temple at Karnak. These are absolutely staggering places. And of course, if you go on a cruise, you'll obviously see Abu Simbel. It's not on this picture collage, but just breathtaking things being built with a huge amount of finances that the Egyptians are obtaining by going up into areas that didn't belong to them. They belonged to other kingdoms, Canaanites and Hurrians, and by setting up and demanding taxes and tributes from those areas. And from that wealth, bringing it in and enriching Egypt and creating all these phenomenal architectural features. Next slide. Oh, thanks, James. And this is the view of the Valley of the Kings from the New Kingdom time period and some of the remarkable tombs that have been found there and some of the remarkable artwork. If I understand right, on the World Cruise, one of the excursions is to see the Valley of the Kings and to see the tomb of Tutankhamun and to see the tomb of Nefertiti and some of the others that are in this area that are absolutely worth it. And no, you won't see every single tomb, because to do that would take a month of time and all the permits and permissions to get into them. But these are absolutely wonderful. Some allow photography, some do not allow photography, and that's partly an attempt to keep flash photography and lights from leaching away all the pigment on some of these walls. Next slide. Oh, Howard Carter. What a story. You know, people oftentimes like to talk about the curse of the pharaohs. And Carter was a really interesting man. He had worked for a number of years with Sir Flinders Matthew Petrie and other Egyptologists. He was not a highly trained university type of Egyptologist, but he was a man of great meticulous detail. And he was willing to spend 5 years of exploration in the Valley of the Kings, where he assumed there might be an undiscovered tomb waiting, and finally found the tomb of Tutankhamun. And then so carefully, so diligently photographed every object in place. He had experts from England come to help him with the chemical conservation of this material. And indeed, everything that he brought out was then taken to the area of the Cairo Museum for further display. The famous British Lord Carnarvon had been the financial underwriter of this project, and Carnarvon loved ancient Egypt, and he had his own small little private museum of artifacts that he had purchased at a point in time when you could legally purchase artifacts with the permission of the Egyptian government. But no, he didn't get to purchase anything from the tomb of King Tut, because this was all kept together in one assemblage of materials. Now, you've probably heard the story of the curse of the Pharaoh and those who worked in the tomb of Tutankhamun. And I don't believe in that, because I'll point out that the man who's seated in the chair there working with the sarcophagus of King Tut, Howard Carter, he would die at age 64 in 1939, and he would die of Hodgkin's lymphoma. And it was not a curse. It was a disease for which there was no treatment at that point in time. It would be decades later that we would have a way of treating that. It had not been a disease he contracted in the tomb. It had simply been his fate, his destiny. And so those stories of the curses of tombs are wonderful and lovely. Sometimes tombs, if there's not enough air circulation in them, you'll feel like they're cursed, because you'll literally eat up the oxygen and be left with little but carbon dioxide. And I've actually worked with my wife on some Roman tomb projects where we suddenly began to realize we were starting to suffocate because the tomb had lost oxygen. But it's not a curse. It's just the unfortunate of working in an environment like a mine or a basement or a tomb where there might not be enough oxygen to keep you going for as long as you're trying to do work there. Next slide. So King Tut's materials. Right now, as I understand, the plan is the Egyptian government wants to open its new museum in June 2021. It's been making that announcement many times and has had to continuously set that date back. But their number one criteria for the new museum, which will be out near the Giza Plateau, out near the area of pyramids. And I saw it being built several years ago. It's huge and a monumental museum, is to house first and foremost the King Tut materials and to have them in the best level of environmental control and reconserve them and get them all set up so they'll be ideal to be seen. And so I've got my fingers crossed that when I get back to Egypt, the new museum will be open, because I'll be really excited to see it. There was a romance of the old Cairo Museum. There was a phase where things were not kept so clean, you literally had to bring a paper towel with you to clean off the soot on windows to look in at exhibit cases. But that changed about a decade or two ago. And the new museum should be really a state of art. And so it's going to be exciting to see that. Now, there was a media flurry a few years ago, you may have seen, where an Egyptologist claimed that he had ground-penetrating radar evidence of secret chambers full of more artifacts off the side of King Tut's tomb. And that created a lot of excitement. And all of us wish that was true. But when they went back and re-examined the ground-penetrating radar data, and I've worked with ground-penetrating radar, the interpretation was not that clear. And they finally had to do what I would have done, and that is drill a very small, thin hole in several sections of wall and put a little periscope in to see if you could see anything behind that wall. And in reality, no secret chambers full of additional artifacts were found. Doesn't mean it won't happen tomorrow, but it seems unlikely to happen that when re-examining the ground-penetrating radar data and then proofing it by some carefully drilled holes and look-sees behind the wall, there doesn't seem to be anything more than the treasures that have been found by the original excavation by Lord Carter. Next slide. Howard Carter. So Greco-Roman era and after, my next set of discussion topics. Next slide. So the Greeks got into Egypt with Alexander the Great, who was beating up on some tough guys who had invaded Egypt, who were called the Persians. You know them as modern Iranians. And the Persians had been attempting to conquer not only Egypt, but they had pushed all the way up against the Greeks. And they had gotten Alexander's father a little sore. And Alexander finally decided the Persians need to be put in their place. And so he drives them out of modern-day Turkey. He drives them out of modern Syria and Lebanon and Israel and Palestine. And he knows there's a bunch of them down in Egypt. He goes down and defeats them in Egypt. And the Egyptians are so thrilled. They tell him they are going to make him a god and that he will have superhuman powers and that there should be a new city for this god, Alexandria. That's how Alexandria, Egypt is formed. He goes all the way up into Upper Egypt, and he apparently had a great deal of tourist fun. And did he believe that the Egyptians could give him those kinds of powers? Hard to tell. He would eventually go crush the Persian Empire. He would get all the way up into Afghanistan in his explorations before finally dying from traveler's distress far from home, from Greece, and brought back not to Greece, not to Macedonia, but brought back to Egypt, where he'd be buried in his city of Alexandria. There would be a tradition of early Christianity in Egypt. Now, if you have a chance to visit Egypt, you'll meet people who are called Coptic Christians. And they believe that when the Holy Family, that was Mary, Joseph, Jesus, and he had a nanny, by the way, Jesus had a nanny in their tradition. When they left and fled from Herod the Great, they came to Egypt, and they were such good people that the Jewish communities in Egypt gave them housing and gave them food. And they could tell this family was something special. And indeed, Jesus and his family returned back up into the area of Palestine. But they always remembered this family. And there are many churches in Egypt today built in locations where the Holy Family had visited during the time when Christ was just an infant. The Apostle Mark would come down as an evangelist bringing Christianity to Egypt. There is also a tradition that Mary Magdalene may well have also come into Egypt. And we've got fragments of many Gospels that have been found, particularly at a site called Oxyrhynchus, an early Roman site, indicating that Christianity spread into Egypt, and people, they had it. They had books of it. They had scrolls of it. They had letters of it. And that it took a very strong early foothold. It did not convert everyone. Everyone did not convert immediately from being traditional worshipers of a pantheon of gods and goddesses. But within individuals, particularly probably those of the Jewish community, there was at least an acceptance of this and a willingness to embrace Christianity. There would be the famous Lighthouse of Alexandria, by the way. We've got 2 replicas shown of it there. And before you say, well, you archaeologists don't know what you're talking about, how do you know it looked like that? I'll let you in a secret. There have been little clay models of the lighthouses found at various locations. People thought they were kind of neat, like we think the Statue of Liberty is neat. They had little models of them, little models of the Eiffel Tower, little models of the Tower of London exist, right? And people, we find these archaeologically. They're not very large, they're not very detailed, but they give us some basic proportions that must allow us to reconstruct from the foundations that survive what the lighthouse looked like. Next slide, James. So the Roman Empire, oh my gosh, Julius Caesar and these guys, they wanted to take, and they did take, Egypt away from the Greeks. And there was some tussling about this, and this beautiful woman named Cleopatra becomes involved in it. And during part of the battles between the Romans and the Greeks and the Egyptians, the famous library catches fire and burns down, partially burns down, we're told. And that when they ask Cleopatra what she would like for a date present, she tells Mark Antony, I'd like a whole library to replace the one you guys messed up. And so he brought her the Library of Pergamon, which the librarians did not appreciate, but she did. The importance of Egypt was just not because of the beauty of Cleopatra, though. It was a breadbasket in terms of creating huge amounts of wheat in a predictable amount every year. And so controlling it controlled your ability to feed the city of Rome, Remember, those breads and circuses was important to keep the population of Rome in good sorts. And Egypt was the source of that. Next slide. With the collapse of the Byzantine Empire, the weakening of it, Islamic armies coming out of Arabia would invade, and they would capture Syria and Palestine. They would invade and capture into the area of Egypt. Then they would spread across North Africa, across the countries of Tunisia and Algeria, all the way eventually to Morocco. And during this time period, the Arabs were not very tolerant of the polytheism that had existed among the pagan Egyptians. They were more tolerant of the Jews and of the Christians. And it was some of this intolerance towards the paganism that allowed them to decide that finally, well, the Library of Alexandria is predominantly pagan information and literature, and those scrolls could serve a very good function, and that was to heat a steam bath. And most of the Library of Alexandria that had survived the time from Julius Caesar's fightings was lost then during the early Islamic period. There would be a change from the various Arab caliphates like the Ayyubids and the Mamluks into the Turkish-controlled Ottoman Empire around 1517. Next slide, please. So the 19th and 20th centuries, oh my goodness, that's like days of talk about just that subject alone. Next slide, James. Let's quickly look at a few things. The Rosetta Stone found during this time of transition into the Ottoman Empire. And this artifact is in the British Museum, found by French archaeologists who were messing around for Napoleon. And they put it on the dock, and the next thing they knew, the British fleet showed up and captured it. It was the translation of the inscriptions on this, 3 different scripts: Egyptian hieroglyphic, Demotic script, which is an Egyptian script, sort of shorthand, and then ancient Greek allowed them to first identify names and then to identify how the grammar and the vocabulary works, and amazing things we can read. Next slide. The building of the Suez Canal, a French enterprise, which took a lot of energy and labor, for which the Egyptian government at that point in time did not sink very much money, but sank labor, literally forcing villages after villages of men and women to come and work on the process of digging the canal and moving the soils as their contribution to the Suez Canal. If you would, a contribution of labor equal to that of the value of equipment. And after completed, to the surprise of the French, the bonds for it were purchased and bought up predominantly by England. Though built by France, it would be managed and controlled by the British. Next slide. The British understood the value of Egypt because by controlling the Suez Canal and controlling Egypt, they felt they were going to be able to maintain their links to India, which is this huge wealth that was being generated for the British Empire out of India. And bringing that wealth through the Suez Canal, through the area of Egypt, was essential. Thus, the British Protectorate was there to make sure that Egypt remained docile and that their ability to control the canal would always be one open to them. Next slide, James. During the time period of the 20th century, we've got a variety of individuals who had started off like the Sultan had been an individual during the Ottoman interchange also, but then we get King Fahd and King Farouk ruling the country. Oh my gosh, King Fuad was so unpopular that his own brother shot him in the neck. And his second wife so disliked King Fuad that when he died, she went and took all of his fine clothes out of the palace and went to a second-hand shop and dumped them off and said, I want peasants to wear the guy's clothes. And then she left the country because she had been absolutely peeved with him. Following King Fawad, King Farouk was in many ways equally unpopular and equally unreasonable kind of man, and finally would be pressured into leaving the country And his demand was that they had to allow him to take everything he owned out of his palace, which also meant lots and lots of the treasury, apparently, and would leave Egypt in quite a poor state at the point where he's forced to abdicate. Next slide. Well, Jamal Abdel Nasser, there in the Sudan, is one of these guys who knew that they had to change Egypt from these monarchs who had just been such playboys and such irresponsible characters. And he wanted, as a military officer, to impose a level of military discipline and control into Egypt. And indeed, almost all recent Egyptian leaders have been drawn out of the ranks of the military. Next slide. Nasser made a big gamble. He had wanted in many ways, to be allied with the West, but eventually discovered that they were unwilling to support him. They actually really had preferred a puppet like King Farouk that was easier to manage. And so Nasser turned to the Soviet Union for support, and he made the most outrageous decision to take the Suez Canal and nationalize it, and to take it away from the control of the British government. And this led to a real catastrophe. Was the West going to allow this to happen? And the decision by the French and the British was, with the aid of the Israelis, they would be able to retake the Suez Canal. But the question was that something that Dwight Eisenhower, the Americans, and the Russians were going to allow to happen? Next slide. The Suez crisis was one of several of these early crises that would be gut-wrenching. Nasser would survive the Suez crisis. He would survive all types of difficulties, and would only then later on be replaced by one of his lieutenants, Anwar Sadat. And you know, I've just got a minute to tell you the story, but I was digging and working in Egypt in 1981, and on the very day that Sadat was assassinated, I was listening to the military parade on the radio in the city of Abu Kamal. And when this all happened, one of my Egyptian friends recognized the sounds of gunfire in the radio. And he said, we've got to go. We've got to go hide, because things are going to get very bad very quick. And he was right. Now, here's a story I want to tell you that you don't learn out of history books many times. Most history books will tell you that Sadat's assassination was in response to his making peace with Israel. It's a part of the story. But where I was in the villages of Abu Kamal and of the village of Tel Rataba, and I was talking with the Egyptian farmers and tradesmen about what had happened, their answer for why Sadat was assassinated was nothing to do with the Israeli peace agreement. He had 100 palaces. He had one fancy uniform he wore every day. And then the most phenomenal accusation: he had paid for the assassination of a popular Egyptian musician, Kulthum. You know, later on, nobody found 100 palaces. Nobody found 365 uniforms. And the suggestion that he had assassinated Kulthum, it doesn't really sound reasonable. But there had been all of these created stories about him. I don't think he was a bad man. I think he had a hard time balancing the economic inequalities of his country, his religious fervor, and lots of other things. Of course, Sadat would be followed by his weak lieutenant, Hosni Mubarak. And I remember when they swore him in as the new leader of Egypt, all the villagers were laughing. They said, you know what he looks like? He looks like the picture of a laughing cow on a chunk of cheese, a favorite food in Egypt. And you know what? The laughing cow had the last laugh. He ruled Egypt for 30 years. They thought he would be quickly replaced. He would be replaced by Mohamed Morsi, whose brief reign, elected official, had many issues related to his decisions about the country, its direction it was going, its treatment of its minorities. And he would then be replaced by a coup by Abdel Fattah el-Sisi, who still remains in power at this point in time. Hours could be spent talking about each one of these guys, and just a couple of stories I hope you enjoyed. Next slide, James. Oh my gosh, rapid population growth. What a huge problem for Egypt. And a top-heavy economy, heavily dependent on tourism. So many problems, limited arable land, political unrest. Egypt's got some tough years still ahead of us, but I think it's coming out of the tunnel. Next slide. Well, look at all the things we've talked about. The unification of Egypt, the Old Kingdom, the New Kingdom. I told you a docudrama story. The period of the Greeks and the Romans, the building of the Suez Canal, the sultanates, and then the modern Egypt. Next slide. I hope I've whetted your appetite to be with me and to look at these amazing places and to meet these amazing, wonderful, warm people. The Egyptians are very warm people. And I know sometimes the media portrays them as angry in all these other ways, but trust me, if you have a chance to visit, the hospitality of Egypt will always make you want to come back. Just one last thing to tell you. Whatever you do in Egypt, don't drink the water of the Nile. Yes, I've seen tourists on an old adage that once you drink the water, you have to return. And all I can tell you is if you drink from the water of the Nile without purifying it and boiling it, you won't be returning to Egypt. You'll be finding your stateroom really quickly. All right. You know what I mean. All right. James, I think that's the end of our presentation and storytelling. There I am.
Michael, hi. So we've got some questions for you now.
Yes, please.
Yes. So first question comes in from Kimberly in the United States. She says, we now understand that DNA is commonly available to the public and scientific community. Has there been any interest in linking modern Egyptians to the pharaonic era?
There was an extensive amount of DNA analysis done by Zaki Hawaz on the pharaonic skeletons that were in the mummies in the Egyptian Museum. And it was very interesting because he released some of the raw data, but not all of the raw data. And some people have sort of been after him to make all of that data fully available. And why he hasn't, well, that's his decision. DNA has an interesting sort of double-edged sword because sometimes people can say, well, my DNA is the same as that mummy's DNA, but yours isn't, so this is my land and not yours. And I think the Egyptians certainly don't want to see themselves thrown into a new sort of crisis of nationality. To an extent, Egypt is today a country of both Arabs, Muslims, and Coptic Christians, and a very small Jewish population. And so these are problems that probably they're not going to be eager to follow. I'm out of power. Next question, please.
Okay, comes in from Lola in Toronto, and she said, why are the pyramids of Saqqara just being discovered now?
Oh, those pyramids have been known for a long time. It's this new tomb of this Queen Neat that was just discovered, and that's because she wasn't buried in a pyramid. She's buried in a shaft tomb that's down near the pyramid of King Teti. And the shaft tombs had been sealed. They're very deep. They've had to remove the overburden to get to that material.
Next question.
Yes.
Comes in from Brendan in the United States, and he said, can you tell us about the association between ancient Egypt and cats? Were the Egyptians the first civilization to domesticate them?
Oh, I'm a cat lover, and they are really inscrutable creatures, aren't they? And it looks like cats somewhat domesticated themselves in Egypt. They began to discover rodents being attracted to the facilities where the Egyptians were storing grain. And And the Egyptians saw the advantage of the cats taking these little vermin out. And indeed, there are early cat skeletons from other parts of the Mediterranean, but our earliest representations of them in art and our earliest representations of a fondness towards them certainly stretches back to Egypt.
Thanks, Michael. Questions coming from Retta in Parkland. And it says, I know the pyramids were built as a religious site, but can you tell us about the construction? How were they built, and were they owned by kings and queens, or could all citizens of ancient Egypt worship them?
Oh, if I had the absolute answer to make everyone happy on how they were built, I would be a very famous Egyptologist. There are still competing ideas. I tend to go along with the ramp theory, that they were building ramps and moving the blocks up the ramps and then disassembling the ramps, which were stone and wood and materials, and burying that around the base of the pyramids. Certainly, you did not get to go in the pyramid unless you were one of the artisans constructing it. The purpose of entering it, it would be to place the body of the pharaoh and his wife. Sometimes they're buried. A few of them, of the great pyramids, have queen chambers as well as king chambers, but then they were sealed and they were blocked, and they probably didn't allow citizens to climb on them in ancient times at all. You could come to the foot of the Sphinx and say prayers and leave offerings. You could go to what were called the mortuary temples. Those were acceptable, but they were things of great sacredness, and in some ways also political symbols. The bigger your pyramid, the greater your political power, the greater the wealth that you had provided Egypt.
Thank you. Next question is from Antoinette in Milton, which I believe is in the US, and they have put, do you think that there will be many other discoveries still to be made in Egypt? Will new technology help to identify new sites for archaeological digs?
You know, in my lifetime, we have evolved so many new technologies. I remember the first time that archaeologists were able to use electrical resistivity at a site called Tel El Maskuta, which was an absolutely flat archaeological site being excavated by the University of Toronto in Canada. And by electrical resistivity, they could go across this flat surface, and they suddenly discovered hundreds of anomalies. And when they excavated down, the first anomaly was a statue, and the second anomaly was a statue. And they suddenly realized there was a field of statues. And the question was, how many did they need to excavate? How many did they want to excavate? How many did the Egyptian Museum want to have? And so these new technologies revolutionized the ways we can do work. Now it's even better with ground penetrating radar. You can even get further detail that was not available with things like earth resistivity or magnetometry work. And the new technologies continue to revolutionize my field. I came home from the pandemic problem, and I went out and I rented a handheld X-ray refractor to do elemental analysis on paintings and cave walls that you simply, like in Star Trek, point and shoot, and you get the chemical analysis of the pigments. So these new technologies allow us to better understand what we're finding, and let us sometimes find things we had not previously been able to identify. There's a whole number of archaeologists using satellite imagery and space imagery, using various filters to look at that data and pinpoint sites, sometimes buried several feet or meters underneath sand.
Daryl from New York says, can you tell us more about why the Egyptian civilization ended? Was there a dramatic ending, such as a war, famine, etc., or did it just gradually change and decline?
You know, after about the 19th dynasty, things began to sort of spin down, and other empires began to grow in power. Hittite Empire up in Turkey, the Persian Empire in modern-day Iran, Iraq, and you might say they were ready for another revolution. They were ready for another sort of revitalization. Another kingdom needed to be born. Just about the time of Cleopatra, who might well have thought her to be that person. But has existed in these three epic periods: the Old Kingdom, the Middle Kingdom, the New Kingdom, and it had waned and then found itself the victim of powerful empires that had arisen in its weakness.
Thank you. Flavio from Hillsborough said, I've read some articles which suggest archaeologists might be on the brink of discovering Cleopatra's tomb. What are your thoughts on this?
I think 10 years ago, I was interviewed by Fox News. Can you imagine? On the report that they were on the verge of finding Cleopatra's tomb, and they wanted my impression of the data. And so I looked online at what had been found, and it's the same site where the Golden Tongue mummy was discovered, by the way, which has been proposed as the location of Cleopatra's secret tomb. And doesn't mean it's not there, but it seems unlikely. It's more likely she was buried in sort of the royal necropolis of the Ptolemies, which would be in the area of modern-day Alexandria. And the tomb outside of town has been suggested, but I'm not won over by it at all.
Kirsty, her question, she actually says, I remember your lecture on Viking TV last year about the spice routes, which was very interesting. Can you tell us more about the types of food and the herbs and spices eaten by the ancient Egyptians, please?
Oh, the Egyptians had a wonderful cuisine, and they had lots of legumes. They, believe it or not, were quite fond of onions, and you get onions used in several of their preparations and their dishes. Just like modern Egypt, ancient Egypt was enthralled with bread, and they liked bread in all different types of shapes and flavors, and little sesame seeds added into it, and all these are part of the tradition that goes back to Egypt. And as I think I mentioned earlier, even beer making. We see beer making installations at Hierakonpolis, and now the new ones found at Abydos, as well as wine making. Now, you don't think of Egypt today as a wine source, but it had wineries for both red wine and white wine. And we know King Tut got buried with one of his favorite show-off wines, a pomegranate wine, which was very sweet. And so Egyptians were lovers of meat. Barbecued animals were a great pleasure for them, but also lots of bread and vegetables, and a diet that would sometimes have the sweets in them also.
Vera from the US, she says, do you know how many pyramids were built in total and how many one can see today on a visit to Egypt?
Oh, I think it's somewhere in the realm of approximately 100 pyramids, and many of them very small, some of them taken apart, and we only have the footprints or the bases of them. The three pyramids of Giza are the ones that most people get to visit. The Step Pyramid at Saqqara of King Zoser is a commonly visited one. I'm one of these crazy guys. I've taken tour groups out to see the Step Pyramid that's out on the plateau, many miles away, beautiful pyramid structure. Generally, most people are happy seeing 2 or 3 pyramids on a tour. There is surprisingly very little to be seen inside a pyramid, by the way. The walls were not decorated. That would be the concept that would come about in the Middle Kingdom and in the New Kingdom of decorated tomb walls. So, and going into them is a little physically challenging. I have been into all 3 of them on the Giza Plateau. And on a hot day with too many tourists in them, you feel a little bit like you've gone into a microwave oven. But there's still remarkable things to visit.
Thank you. William from the United States, he has said, is it true that ancient Romans would travel to Egypt to see the pyramids, i.e. they would go as tourists?
Indeed. We actually find graffiti by both Greek and Roman tourists all over Egypt, left on various monuments, because they were absolutely fascinated with the idea of a civilization they understood being so far older than their own. And there was a strong belief that the gods of ancient Egypt weren't dead, that they were still able to offer some power and assurance, particularly the goddess Isis, the god Serapis. And so if you went on a tour, you not only went there to see the pyramids and some of the temples and other amazing things, but you went there hoping to have a little bit of its magic rub off on you.
Bill from Windsor in Canada, he says, thank you for this intriguing presentation. What do we know of the of the chemists, embalmers who developed the mummification process? What would possess them to try these particular chemicals?
You know, they had apparently discovered in the pre-dynastic period that the burials of bodies in the most dry sands led to this natural form of mummification. And the question must have been well, outside of taking someone out in the deep of the desert and leaving them out, would there be some way to utilize natural materials for this process? And luckily, the natron salts appear in these dried up old lake bed deposits. And they must have looked at that dried lake bed and wondered to themselves if the salt had been the cause of it. No, it wasn't. The changing climate patterns had led to these large oases drying up. But the natron salt left behind in them must have been the clue, a wrong clue, but it still worked, to those ancient priests and chemists that this stuff might have that ability to dry out the body, and it did.
Lewis asks, did the common people get any kind of mummification, or was it assumed that they could not go to the afterlife?
This is one of the things that really is fun about archaeology, is to try not to be totally monopolized by the wealthy and the powerful and the elite who could afford things like mummification, and wonder what some poor farmer did. When I was digging at Tel Rataba in the Nile Delta, I found numerous jar burials of children who had died in infancy, and the family had simply broken a wine jar. They'd broken the base of it off. They inserted the child's body into the wine jar. They'd stuck the base back on, and they had buried it as a very simple coffin. And we had no inscriptions, where there was no prayers. There was no evidence of anything that was part of the standard Egyptian tradition, we understand. No one was reading the Book of the Dead probably on them. There was probably a folk tradition about what was going to happen for that child, and about why he was buried near the village where his parents and his brothers and sisters still lived. And so we do find burials of non-elite individuals, and there must have been a tradition that we still are not as clearly defining as we can for the tradition of the elites who left us the papyrus scrolls and the painted wall tombs.
Callie in London, she asked, can you tell us how important the discovery of the Rosetta Stone was in the understanding of Egyptian culture, please?
What a great question. Oh my gosh, Kelly, before the Rosetta Stone was discovered, there were all these people who were attempting to read hieroglyphics like they were pictures. And there were individuals who believed that there were secret Masonic stories embedded in the pictures. And there's a whole wealth of books that were published before the Rosetta Stone was discovered and translated, attempting to explain the mysteries of Egypt. And once we could actually understand how the hieroglyphics worked, how the grammar and the syntax and the vocabulary functioned, we suddenly realized that we had been led on a wild goose chase with all these fellows who were trying to read the story of the animals, when in fact we've got names of people, we've got historical episodes, we've got dates being given, we've got quite a bit of information. So the Rosetta Stone utterly revolutionized what had almost been hogwash into a science.
Thank you. Marianne in Canada, she asks if you could suggest a book or books before travelling to this area to better inform myself.
You know, there must be an infinite number of Egyptian guidebooks, and they they come out each year bigger and better. And so my recommendation is to make sure you can find one that you can download, right? And you can take on your iPad or your phone or your laptop so that you're not thumbing madly through it. Not one in particular today I'm going to recommend. I haven't written one. If I did, I'd be promoting
that. We've had a nice one come in here from Mary, actually, in Austin. And she asked Michael if you can tell us about the cupboard behind you. She found it very intriguing.
Well, you know, you're in my living room here at our home. And over one shoulder over there is a painting. Oh, that one there. An oil painting from Damascus of a group of Arab men outside the door of a coffee shop from the 1800s. And painting was done, though, last century. And I actually met the painter and bought it from him, brought it back. And over my other shoulder is a replica artifact, not the real artifact, a replica made by my wife, who's also an archaeologist. And it is a wind vane. And it's the kind of wind vane out of copper with feathers and streamers on it that Viking ships would have. And it would tell the sailors the direction from which the wind was coming, and whether that then allowed them to decide whether or not to raise the sail or lower the sail. If you raised the sail, you went faster. And if you lowered the sail, you rowed. And when a Viking ship was in port, they would take the wind vane off of it. In later times, they would put them on the churches to show the direction in which God's breath was coming. So that's a little bit of the background of the inside of my home. I'm so glad you could come and visit. Thank you for asking that question.
We do have another question, and they asked where you got your bow tie from.
This bow tie is a gift to me by my daughter on the day of her wedding in November. And we had a very, very small wedding. We had 4 parents, the bride, the groom, and the minister. And she gave me this bow tie to wear for her wedding. And I'm proud to be able to wear it today.
Oh, that's a lovely story, Michael. Thank you. So I think this is the last question of the evening for you. And it comes in from Gail in the United States. And she would like to know, how did they get light into the pyramids so that they could paint the walls?
They would reflect light, and they would as modern Egyptians will do, reflect light from the sun down through passageways and catch them off of polished mirrors to illuminate the interior. There could sometimes be small oil lamps that would be burning, but that would intend to put some smoke and soot and ash, and we don't see much evidence of that. It seems to be mainly by the illumination.
Okay, that was your last question for this evening, Michael. Thank you.
Thank you. You know, I want to say that on Saturday, I got my first COVID shot. I'm waiting now a month to get the second one. I have the Moderna vaccine. I hope all of those who are watching, who are eager for shots, will be able to get them. And I can tell you that all I got was a sore arm out of it, so don't be afraid. And we'll all soon be quite healthy and maybe not so sequestered. And looking forward to visiting with many of you around the dining table on a Viking cruise ship or on a tour of a museum or a site.